The acrid smell of burnt plastic hit the back of Elena Carter's throat before the first siren even wailed. She had jammed a thick metal rod through the handles of the kitchen fire doors, poured chemical accelerant into the industrial toaster, and pulled the lever. Now the service hallway was rapidly filling with grey, heavy smoke. Alarms began to blare in rhythmic, deafening pulses, triggering the emergency strobe lights that painted the concrete walls in flashing slashes of white. Elena dropped to her knees, her lungs burning, and grabbed 4-year-old Noah by his small shoulders. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was a steady, fierce whisper right against his ear. "Listen to me, my sweet boy. You are so brave. You remember what we practiced." Noah nodded dumbly, his wide, dark eyes reflecting the flashing emergency lights. He didn't cry. The trauma of losing his mother just weeks ago had left him in a state of quiet, hyper-focused survival. Elena slipped the heavy, parchment envelope into his tiny, charcoal-brown gloved hands. The blood-red wax seal felt warm against his skin. "Walk straight through those big wooden doors at the end of the hall. Don't look back at the smoke, and don't stop for anyone. You find the man at the front of the long table. You put this in his hands." She kissed his forehead, her tears smudging the soot on his cheek. "For Mommy, Noah, go." She gave him a gentle push forward into the haze. As Noah's small boots clicked against the linoleum, Elena turned and ran in the opposite direction, intentionally throwing her weight against a security exit to draw the guards away from the main floor. Noah walked alone. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the overhead sirens vibrating through his chest. He held the letter tight against his ribs like a shield. To a 4-year-old, the world was just a series of giant, unfamiliar shapes, but he remembered his mother's voice telling him that the man with the sharp jaw and the sad eyes would protect him. At the end of the corridor, the massive, ornate mahogany doors of the grand boardroom loomed. Because of the fire protocol, the electronic locks had automatically disengaged to allow for evacuation. Noah reached up, his small fingers barely gripping the heavy brass handle. With all the weight of his tiny body, he leaned back and pulled. The heavy door swung open, revealing a room of absolute, suffocating luxury and dozens of frozen, powerful men who had no idea their empire had just been breached. The sudden click of the heavy brass handle was lost beneath the booming voice of a senior director, but the rush of cool, smoke-tinged air from the corridor instantly changed the pressure in the room. 50 men in bespoke tailoring froze. At the front of the long, polished mahogany table, the live stream camera, broadcasting this critical shareholder vote to institutional investors across London and Seoul, captured a tiny, unexpected silhouette reflecting perfectly on the mirror-like wood. Noah stepped over the threshold. His humble charcoal-brown coat was dusted with a fine layer of grey soot, making him look like a ghost that had materialized directly from the concrete foundations of the skyscraper. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the suffocating shock of an elite world being breached by complete innocence. No one moved, no one even breathed. Noah didn't look at the high, Gothic-arched windows or the ornate tapestries lining the walls. His wide, solemn gaze anchored directly onto the man sitting in the massive, carved wooden chair at the head of the table. Seo Junho sat rigidly, his deep royal blue velvet coat accented by gold embroidery that caught the harsh glare of the studio lights. A moment ago, his authority had been absolute, an unyielding wall of hereditary power. But as Noah walked steadily toward him, bypassing the entire hierarchy of the room, Junho's posture began to crack. His chest tightened. Noah reached the edge of the table. Without a hint of fear, he extended his small arms, holding out the heavy parchment envelope. The brilliant, blood-red wax stamp bore a private, hand-carved crest that had not been seen in 5 years, a crest Junho had buried in the deepest, darkest corner of his memory. The billionaire's breath hitched. The blood drained from his face so fast it turned a terrifying, translucent pale, his jaw dropping in a gasp of utter vulnerability. His hand flew to his chest, clutching the gold embroidery over his heart, as if the paper in the boy's hands had physically pierced him. It wasn't just a child standing before him, it was a living, breathing accusation. As the live stream camera continued to roll, capturing every micro-gesture of his public collapse, Junho stared into the child's dark, familiar eyes and realized the terrible, beautiful truth. His carefully guarded empire was already burning from the inside out. Down in the soaring, marble-paneled lobby, the atmosphere was clinical and hostile. Elena Carter's wrists rubbed against the harsh plastic of temporary zip ties, the constraints biting into her skin as two burly corporate security guards held her pinned against a cold stone pillar. Around them, the building's automated fire suppression systems hummed, but the real emergency in this room was her. The heavy glass doors of the executive elevator slid open, and Director Vance, the conglomerate's ruthless head of global security, stormed out. His face was twisted in a mask of controlled fury, his eyes scanning the glass walls to ensure no passing pedestrians could see the scene. He stopped inches from Elena, his voice a low, threatening hiss. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You breached a high-security international broadcast. We can have you buried in a federal holding cell before the sun goes down, and no one will ever hear your name again." Elena didn't flinch. Her clothes still smelled faintly of the smoke from the VIP kitchen, and her hair was windswept, but she threw her shoulders back and looked directly into Vance's eyes. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. Instead, a cold, sharp smile cut through the soot on her face. "Try it," Elena whispered, her voice carrying a terrifyingly calm authority that made the guards' grips loosen just a fraction. "Before I walked into this fortress, I uploaded digital scans of Noah's original birth certificate, complete with Seo Jun-ho's verified biological markers, to secure servers at the BBC, the Financial Times, and Hankyoreh." Vance froze, his calculated composure instantly fracturing. "I set a dead man's switch," Elena continued, leaning forward, the plastic ties snapping tight against her skin. "If I don't log in and input a safety code every 2 hours, those files are automatically published. By midnight, the entire world will know that the Seo dynasty's rightful heir is sitting in your boardroom and that your security team is currently holding his aunt hostage in the lobby." She tilted her head, her gaze unyielding. "So go ahead, call the police, or better yet, call your billionaire boss and ask him if he wants his stock prices to plummet to zero by morning. Because you cannot make that boy disappear anymore, Director. The truth is already out." The iron gates of the Blackwood estate slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud, cutting off the distant roar of London's media vans. Inside the vaulted, wood-paneled library, the atmosphere was suffocating. Rain lashed against the high-arched windows, casting distorted shadows across the thousands of leather-bound books that lined the walls. This wasn't a sanctuary, it was a gilded cage. Seo Jun-ho stood by the fireplace, his royal blue coat now discarded, leaving him in a stark white shirt with sleeves rolled up. His eyes, sharp and hyper-focused, darted between the two people sitting on the velvet sofa. Noah was fast asleep, his small head resting heavily in Elena's lap, his charcoal coat serving as a makeshift blanket. Elena sat perfectly rigid, her freshly freed wrists red and bruised, her gaze meeting the billionaire with unyielding defiance. "A dead man's switch to the international press," Jun-ho began, his voice dangerously low, clipping each word with surgical precision. He stepped forward, slamming a sleek medical kit onto the mahogany table between them. "That isn't the behavior of a grieving aunt looking for family, Ms. Carter. That is the execution of a highly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar corporate blackmail scheme." Elena didn't flinch. She gently stroked Noah's tight curls, her voice a sharp, quiet blade. "I did what I had to do to keep him alive. If I hadn't forced your hand publicly, your board would have erased us before we left the lobby. You expect me to believe a child born in a London suburb is the heir to Korean dynasty because of a wax seal?" Jun-ho's jaw tightened, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. He opened the kit, revealing 2 sterile buccal swabs. "My late lover left this country 5 years ago. She never told me about a pregnancy. If you want to survive the night without my security team handing you over to Interpol, you will let me take his DNA. Now." "I welcome it," Elena whispered, standing up slowly so as not to wake the boy. She stepped into Jun-ho's personal space, her eyes burning with an absolute truth that shook him to his core. "Take his blood, take his hair, take whatever you need to satisfy your cynicism. But know this, billionaire, when that paper comes back positive, it won't be me you're at war with. It will be the monsters in your own boardroom who lied to you for 4 years." The storm outside finally breached the heavy glass of the study, a low, ominous rumble vibrating through the floorboards as Seo Junho sat alone beneath the dim glow of a single desk lamp. The rest of the grand manor was dead silent. On the green blotter before him lay the parchment envelope, its blood-red wax seal now cracked in half. His fingers, usually so steady during multi-billion-dollar acquisitions, trembled as he unfolded the thick, tear-stained pages written in a handwriting he would recognize even in the dark. Junho, if Noah is holding this, it means I am gone, and they have won. The first line shattered his remaining defenses, but it was the third page that completely rewired his reality. Tucked inside the letter were folded, ink-faded printouts of wire transfer receipts, offshore bank statements, and encrypted email threads spanning 4 years. Junho's eyes scanned the documents, his breath catching as the horrific architecture of a multi-year conspiracy was laid bare. The twist was agonizingly clear. His past lover had never abandoned him. She had never taken the $50 million settlement his family had claimed she ran away with. Instead, the board of directors, led by his own trusted mentor, Director Vance, had intercepted every single letter, blocked every international phone call, and falsified bank records to make it appear as though she had taken a payout to disappear. They had systematically isolated her in a London flat, cutting off her resources while feeding Junho a meticulously crafted lie to force him into a politically advantageous corporate marriage. Worse still, a final invoice from a private security firm in London showed a payout delivered just days before her fatal car accident. It was labeled simply, "Problem Closure." Junho sank back into his heavy leather chair, the paper crinkling in his white-knuckled grip. A sickening wave of vertigo washed over him. For 4 years, he had built a global empire on a foundation of absolute cynicism, hardening his heart against the world because he believed the only woman he ever loved had traded his soul for cash. He had trusted the monsters at his table, believing they were his guardians, while the true heir to his lineage was wearing a faded charcoal coat and sleeping on a couch downstairs. Looking at the digital signatures of his board members at the bottom of the wire transfers, Junho's grief instantly curdled into something lethal. His absolute certainty was gone, replaced by a cold, burning rage. They hadn't just protected an empire, they had stolen his life. A piercing, suffocating shriek shattered the midnight silence of Blackwood Estate, echoing down the high-vaulted corridors. Seo Junho was out of his chair in an instant, sprinting down the grand staircase toward the drawing room. When he threw the heavy oak doors open, his heart seized. Noah was trapped in the corner behind a massive velvet curtain, his small body hyperventilating in rapid, shallow gasps. His eyes were wide, vacant, and glazed with a terrifying, wild panic. He was clawing frantically at his own throat, suffocating under the weight of a nightmarish memory. The giant, unfamiliar shadows of the historic manor hall had triggered the raw, unhealed trauma of the smoky corridor and the sudden, lonely loss of his mother. Junho instinctively rushed forward, his voice booming with executive authority. "Call my personal physician, get an oxygen tank up here now." But as the billionaire reached out his hands that routinely commanded global markets, Noah let out a defensive, glass-shattering scream, shrinking deeper into the woodwork. Junho froze, his arms suspended in midair. He looked around the opulent room, at the crystal decanters, the priceless oil paintings, and the dark tapestries. For the first time in his life, a cold realization struck him like a physical blow. His billions of dollars, his absolute societal power, and his heavily guarded security details were completely, utterly useless here. He could buy an international hospital, but he could not buy this child a single breath of air. "Step back, Junho, you're crowding him." Elena pushed past him, her voice entirely devoid of panic. She didn't drop to her knees with force. Instead, she sat flat on the cold hardwood floor a few feet away from Noah, intentionally lowering her stature to match his. She didn't offer a medical solution. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, frayed piece of red yarn, a remnant from her sister's old knitting basket. "Noah," Elena murmured, her voice breathing a warm, everyday simplicity into the freezing, luxury room. Breathe with me, sweet boy, smelling the flowers, blowing out the candles. Slowly, deliberately, she began to tie a simple knot in the yarn, her movements calm and predictable. Noah's erratic breathing hitched. His gaze slowly shifted from the terrifying shadows to her hands. Elena didn't rush. She just kept humming a soft, familiar lullaby, extending her arms until Noah clumsily lunged forward, burying his tear-streaked face into her shoulder. As Elena wrapped him in a fierce, protective embrace, Junho stood in the shadows, completely humbled, realizing that the only currency that mattered in this house was a mother's love, inherited by an aunt who possessed absolutely nothing else. The flash of a smartphone screen illuminated the darkened study just before dawn, casting a cold, blue glow across Director Vance's sharp features. With a single encrypted keystroke, the corrupt board member routed an altered PDF into the mainstream media pipeline. By 6:00 a.m., the calculated strike had hit every major financial news outlet from London to Seoul. The headlines were savage, moving with the speed of a coordinated execution. SEO conglomerate hoax, DNA results prove Afro-Korean toddler is an imposter. Junho stood at the high windows of his study, watching the iron gates of Blackwood Estate buckle under the sudden, aggressive surge of predatory paparazzi. Below, journalists were already shouting into cameras, spinning a narrative that painted Elena as a desperate extortionist and Noah as a weapon used to manipulate stock prices. The conglomerate's shares were already in a freefall, plummeting 8% in pre-market trading. The heavy oak door clicked open, and Vance walked in, his expression a perfectly tailored mask of grave concern. He held up a tablet displaying the morning markets. Junho, it's a disaster. The public believes you fell victim to a highly sophisticated scam. The board is already calling for an emergency session. They want a vote of no confidence if you don't publicly distance yourself from the woman and the child immediately. Junho didn't turn around. His eyes were fixed on the reflection of the envelope on his desk, his white shirt crisp, but his posture terrifyingly still. Thanks to the intercepted history he had read just hours prior, he knew exactly whose signatures had authorized the medical lab's recent offshore retention fees. The pipeline hadn't failed. It had been infected from the inside. They want me to issue a statement labeling him a fraud, Junho murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made Vance step back a fraction. It's the only way to stabilize the stock, Chairman, Vance pressed, his eyes narrowing. We must declare the boy an imposter and hand the aunt over to the authorities, for the sake of the dynasty. Junho finally turned, his gaze locking onto his mentor with a lethal, unreadable intensity. He could hear Noah's quiet, innocent laughter echoing from the gardens below, completely oblivious to the multi-billion-dollar war being waged over his bloodline. The board thought they had engineered the perfect checkmate by trading on his old cynicism. They believed he would sacrifice a child to save his crown. But looking at Vance, the billionaire realized the monsters had fundamentally miscalculated. They had built a fortress to protect an empire, but they had just given a father a reason to tear it down. The rain-slicked neon of a forgotten corner of East London blurred against the windshield of the unmarked sedan. For the first time, Seo Junho sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting heavily on an encrypted laptop, while Elena Carter directed the path through the narrow, brick-walled alleys. The corporate tycoon and the working-class aunt had formed an uneasy, lethal synchronization, a partnership forged not in a boardroom, but in the desperate need to shield a child. He won't be at his registered clinic, Elena whispered, her eyes tracking the dark storefronts. When my sister was hiding, she told me about an underground dispensary near the docks. She said the man who altered her files, Dr. Aris, only operated where the CCTV couldn't reach. He was terrified of your family long before he took their latest bribe. Junho's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the falsified corporate firewalls that Vance's team had erected. I've traced the offshore account that funded the fake DNA report this morning. It matches a shell corporation registered to a private medical courier based right here. If Aris is the handler, he still has the original, untampered genetic profile on a closed local drive. He wouldn't delete his only insurance policy against the board. They found him in a low-ceilinged basement beneath a shuttered maritime pharmacy. When the heavy metal door splintered inward, under the weight of Jun-ho's private security detail, Dr. Aris didn't even try to run. He fell back against a desk cluttered with hard drives, his face turning an ash gray as he recognized the billionaire chairman standing under the flickering halogen bulb. "I had no choice," Aris stammered, his eyes darting to Alina. "Vance's people, they said they'd pull my license. They forced the negative swab into the lab's digital system." Alina stepped past the guards, her presence radiating a cold, maternal fury that completely eclipsed the billionaire's corporate weight. She slammed her sister's old diary onto the desk, right next to the doctor's trembling hands. "You knew her. You knew she was dying, and you let them weaponize her child's bloodline. Give us the uncorrupted files, or I will let the press know exactly who engineered the medical fraud of the century." Within minutes, Jun-ho's encryption software was downloading the raw, unedited DNA sequencing directly from Aris's isolated backup server. The match was undeniable, 99.9% biological compatibility. As the data flooded the screen, illuminating the dark room in a glow of absolute truth, Jun-ho looked at Alina. The corporate chess match was over. Armed with the real records, they finally had the ammunition required to pull the trigger on the empire. The predatory roar of 500 journalists filled the grand auditorium of the London Press Centre, a wall of blinding white camera flashes cutting through the dim room like lightning. They had come for an execution. The corporate narrative was set. Billionaire CEO Jun-ho was supposed to step onto the stage, declare the Afro-Korean toddler an imposter, and resign to save his company's collapsing stock. Backstage, the world was entirely different. In the quiet, shadowed green room, Noah sat curled in Alina's lap. His small hands playing with the frayed piece of red yarn she had given him. He was completely insulated from the multi-billion-dollar wolves outside. Alina looked up as Jun-ho entered, his white shirt crisp, his eyes resembling cold, polished flint. For a second, the tycoon just stared at his son. Then he leaned down and gently touched Noah's tight curls. "Stay here," Jun-ho murmured, his voice cracking with an uncharacteristic, raw warmth. "I am going to finish this." When Jun-ho stepped past the heavy velvet curtains and onto the main stage, the auditorium erupted into shouting. He didn't walk to the podium. He stood dead center under the burning studio lights, completely unscripted, and waited until the suffocating silence returned. Behind him, a massive digital screen flickered to life. "For 4 years, the board of directors of this conglomerate has lied to me, and today they lied to you," Jun-ho announced, his voice booming through the sound system with a lethal, terrifying clarity. "They falsified medical records to hide my son, and this morning they hacked a laboratory pipeline to label him an imposter." A collective gasp rippled through the press corps. Before the microphones could erupt, a secondary door opened, and 3 uniformed officers from Scotland Yard escorted a team of independent chief geneticists from King's College London onto the stage, carrying sealed, high-security medical kits. "We are not waiting for an investigation," Jun-ho declared, stepping directly toward the lead geneticist and rolling up his sleeve. "We are doing a live, independent blood draw broadcasted directly to global markets. The raw DNA sequencing will upload directly to a public server in real time." As the needle pierced Jun-ho's skin, the digital screen behind him began to match his genetic markers side by side with the uncorrupted files recovered from East London. Minutes later, the system flashed a blinding, undeniable result: 99.9% paternal match. The global public watched the conspiracy disintegrate in a matter of seconds. The board had tried to use a child's heritage to destroy a father, but under the blazing lights of the world stage, Jun-ho had just used the absolute truth to execute his own empire. The heavy iron gates of Blackwood Estate were entirely clear of paparazzi when the morning sun finally broke through the London mist. The violent roar of the corporate war had vanished, replaced by a profound, echoing silence that settled over the stone courtyard. In the city, the fallout was catastrophic and absolute. The live broadcast had triggered an immediate federal raid on the conglomerate's headquarters. Director Vance and 4 senior board members had been escorted out in handcuffs, their multi-billion-dollar accounts frozen under international anti-fraud statutes. The corrupt empire was completely dismantled, its pieces scattering into legal history. But inside the vaulted library of the manor, the atmosphere was entirely detached from the financial wreckage. Noah sat on a wide patch of sunlight on the Persian rug, quietly pushing a small wooden toy car across the floor. He was no longer hyperventilating, no longer running from shadows. The charcoal brown coat was gone, replaced by a soft, clean sweater, though he still kept the small piece of frayed red yarn tucked securely into his pocket. Elena stood by the tall arched windows, her bags packed and resting neatly by the door. She watched the boy, her shoulders finally dropping from the defensive posture she had maintained for weeks. She had executed the truth. Her sister's child was safe, his heritage legally unassailable, and her job was done. "The car is ready to take you back to the city," Seo Junho said quietly, stepping into the room from the shadows of the hallway. He wasn't wearing his royal blue coat or the gold-embroidered armor of his dynasty. He stood in a simple black sweater, his posture humbled, looking less like a ruthless tycoon and more like a man who had survived a shipwreck. Elena turned, her gaze still cautious, still fiercely protective. "You have the resources to give him everything now, Junho. The world knows he is yours. No one can touch him." "I have nothing," Junho corrected, his voice dropping to a low, raw whisper that caused Elena to freeze. He walked over to the desk, looking at the cracked red wax seal of the letter that had started it all. "I can buy security details, elite schools, and international lawyers, Elena, but I don't know how to heal his panic attacks. I don't know the lullaby that makes him breathe again." He turned to face her, his sharp eyes glistening with a sudden, devastating vulnerability. "My empire means absolutely nothing if my son grows up in a golden cage, not knowing who he truly is. He needs the warmth his mother gave him. He needs you." Junho stepped forward, extending his hand, not to offer a transactional contract, but to beg for an alliance. "Stay, permanently, as his co-guardian. Let's raise him together." Elena looked from the billionaire's open hand down to Noah, who suddenly looked up and smiled at her. The long, exhausting battle of distrust was over. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and took his hand, finally sealing a new dynasty built not on blood money, but on absolute love.